Welcome back to our TA support sessions, and today we're going to be covering off a step-by-step guide to writing an assessment tool. This is quite a critical part of any training development processes that happen within a registered training organisation, because history has shown that with ASQA auditing quality within RTO practice, that assessment is often one of the areas that will let down an RTO. And it may not be intentionally, it may just be that the correct checks and measures around quality of assessment tools have not been implemented. So today's session, we're going to start by looking at the ASQA guide to developing assessment tools. To access this, just Google ASQA Guide to Developing Assessment Tools. It's a PDF document, and it's kind of a little refresher about some of the theory that we also talked about previously on this topic. So the contents here will cover a brief summary, a refresher on what is meant by assessment, and then it will talk about the 3 steps, which is planning, so looking at your unit of competency that you're intending to write your assessment around, and then understanding what it's telling us. So we call that step unpacking. So we're going to unpack a unit of competency, and we're going to have a look at different assessment methods that might be suitable for different aspects of units of competency in terms of determining what competence looks like and how we'll have evidence to confirm that. Then we're going to go into the design and development stage, and that will cover off on things like context. So really important before you ever leap into writing an assessment tool, that you really think about what does it look like when it's really happening in the real world. So you might have a unit of competency that could be to do with communication, and that can be a really broad term. So communication in a retail environment will be different to communication in a hospitality environment, different to any sort of work environment really. So your requirements around communication will be quite different. So really thinking clearly in your own mind what the environment is that this student is going to be using these skills in will help us determine what our context is going to be, and then what the conditions of assessment are. And these are things that are stipulated within every unit of competency. So if we have a look at an example of one on training.gov, when you go right down to the very bottom of the unit, if it's a streamlined unit template format that's been written in, then you'll always find there's a particular area here called assessment conditions, and they can sometimes give you very descriptive, non-negotiable, mandatory requirements that you must adhere to when you're completing your assessment activities. So then we're going to think about what tasks will we get our student to do as part of their assessment. So how do we know if they're job ready? How do we know if they've learnt the skills and knowledge required to be able to go out into the workforce and complete activities as if they had been trained well and they were job ready? So we need to have a good think about what that looks like in the real world, and then write our assessment tool accordingly. And then we also need to make sure that we have some outline, like a summary. We call it an assessment plan, that summarises for us to be really hand on heart confident that person is competent in the unit of competency requirements. What evidence do we need to put together on the table and review to come up with that decision about whether someone is competent or not yet competent? So as part of that, to make sure that we have really consistent judgment around those decisions of competency, we then need to have what's called an evidence criteria to judge those individual pieces of evidence. So without having some sort of criteria, you may have different assessors who may say, yep, that's good enough, and I'll mark that person as satisfactory in completing that task, versus someone else who may not, who may be looking for additional behaviours or some higher level of standard to be demonstrated by the candidate. So without having clear guidelines for the assessor, you often can have an unreliable assessment tool. And then, of course, with any sort of assessment process, it is a legal process. So therefore, administration, recording and reporting requirements are very important as part of that. And that then leads to step 3. And step 3 is really just making sure that once you've completed writing your assessment tool, that you can hand on heart say that this process and these particular instruments that we're going to gather evidence with will lead to a solid decision and that we can hand on heart say that the assessment tool is therefore compliant and ready for release. And that's really the summary of what we'll be covering today. So let's scroll down to the first section. So it has a little bit of a summary about making sure that this whole concept of compliant assessment is taken very seriously. It actually sits within the standards for RTOs, so it is a very strong compliance factor, as I mentioned. So RTOs will be assessed against whether or not they've met these standards for RTOs as part of any audit that may happen by the national regulator. There's a little refresher on what is meant by assessment. So it's really the process of collecting the evidence to be able to make these solid judgments on whether competency has been achieved. So really our job as trainer assessors is to ensure that we can enhance the skills and knowledge of our candidates and learners to be job ready when they get out into the workplace. So the assessment process is the final step in that, which really tells us whether or not our job has been done sufficiently that we could then send our little students back out into the workforce knowing that they have developed these skills and knowledge and they'll be safe and suitable to work. The assessment system is really the whole process. So it's a coordinated set of these documents, and you will often have policies and procedures that sit behind some of the tools that we're going to be looking at today. So it's really important that every RTO has these standards for their not just compliance team, but for their trainer assessor team that sets the ground rules about making sure that the assessment process within any training organisation is completed compliantly. And it's most important that they cover off on these principles of assessment and rules of evidence, because they are the standards that are written into the RTO standards for 2015. So in summary, an assessment tool contains these sorts of components. So context and conditions of assessment. So what is it that we are asking the candidate to do in a real world sense? So don't just read the government speak that you might find inside a unit of competency on training.gov. You need to interpret what it's telling us is actually going on in the real world. And then we compare that to our conditions of assessment that are found within the unit of competency to make sure that we've covered off on what has been predetermined for us within the unit of competency as being mandatory requirements of the assessment process. We need to ensure that we document the task to be administered to the student. So we'll be putting together an assessment plan, or we'll be looking at one that's been prepared earlier and talking about how we believe it's best to determine that student is able to demonstrate competency in the assessment process. And then we'll be providing a summary of what we need to gather from the candidate, and then our marking guide, which will be our evidence criteria, so that if you had 10 different assessors looking at the assessment process for a group of students, they would all come up with the same outcome decisions. And often this term also takes into account, the assessment tool term, takes into account any administration, recording and reporting that may be required. The other concept to mention is that sometimes units of competency are assessed as a cluster. And that just means that often the unit of competency will be very similar to another, and they may kind of go together as they would in the real world. So you might combine the assessment of both to one assessment tool, which would cover off on all the requirements of both units of competency or a selection of units of competency. So an example of that might be if you've got a unit of competency where the first unit says to prepare to complete a task, and the second unit says complete the task, and another unit says review whether you've achieved the task correctly. Quite often those three steps would go together within the workplace, and so it's kind of makes sense really to be able to combine the assessing of those three units together as one end-to-end workplace activity. So that's what we call clustering or holistic assessment. So when we come down into our section called Developing Assessment Tools, we've got our three main steps. So that was just a refresh on what we'd talked about previously. So we're going to plan our assessment, we're going to design and develop the components of our assessment tool so that we come up with a finalised tool altogether, and then we're going to have a look at the quality check process that happens at the end. So in refreshing our planning phase, we always refer back to the unit of competency as our very first step. So it's important that we look at all the main areas within a unit of competency that give us the story behind what the expectations are of that unit. So what is it telling us is actually going on in the real world? And this is often called unpacking the unit of competency. So you can pull down a unit of competency from training.gov.au, and I always in the classroom get my students to grab two different colour highlighters, and we have a look at the unit and we pull it apart to say what knowledge is it telling us that our students need to have before they're able to do the skills that are also outlined within the unit of competency. So the main areas that we look at within the unit of competency are these components that are on the screen now. So the first one is the elements. So let's have a look at that in a real unit of competency. So the example that we're going to be working with today is called BSB WHS 201, Contribute to Health and Safety of Self and Others. And if we scroll down to where we have the elements, so that's when we get to the unit sector part of the unit, then it will give us a little table here, and very similar layout will be found within all units of competency. Some of them are the old format, which may be just slightly different, but most are in the process of being upgraded to the format that you see on the screen now. So the first part here that we're looking at is these elements, and these elements often tell a story about what the work activity is that's happening within the workplace. This particular unit is not as clear as to what the story is. And the reason for that is that although this unit of competency comes out of the BSB training package, so the prefix on the unit is BSB, so we know it began life as part of the business services training package, it doesn't really tell us what industry it relates to. It doesn't really tell us anything specific about actual work activities that are happening. And that's because it's a very general unit. If you scroll up and have a look at all the qualifications that this unit sits in, there's 69 of them. And if you look at the different industries that it sits across, you've got everything from hair salons to horse breeding to working in the government to financial services to working with explosives in the military, the music industry, really the list goes on. So because of that, it means that it's most important that we do give this unit a context. So we can't just assess people on what we think working safely looks like. We need to think about what the industry is telling us working safely looks like. And to know what the industry is, we have to come up with what our context is first. So that's the first step, is to really think about which industry are we going to write this unit for. Now, I've completed this activity with countless workshops of students, and we've essentially written this assessment tools around many, many different industries. So whether it's early childhood education or aged care or community care or feedlotting up on the Darling Downs or electrical services industry across the country, then really we've been able to apply these same element outcomes. So these elements are our essential outcomes that would be achieved in a real world environment, and they are forming part of the picture of what's actually going on in that particular industry environment. So the example that we're going to be looking at today as a context is going to be the dance industry. So if you are from the dance industry, then certainly you can read this unit and think about what does working safely look like in the dance industry. But if you don't work for the dance industry, then certainly you can look at it in the context of what your industry would be telling you working safely looks like. So that's the first component, is our elements. The second component is our performance criteria. So whilst the elements are the little outcomes, so that's the end game that we're aiming for, being able to work safely and implement work safety requirements and participate in consultative processes, these performance criteria break it down into expectations or criteria that you would need to see and observe through your assessment process. So this is like the more minute detail of what the expectations are. So it will have more specific requirements, things like carrying out a pre-start system and equipment check, or following a procedure for responding to an emergency incident. So again, if you're reading this, you can probably be picturing what the behaviours might be that you would see in your own individual workplace, because things like your pre-start systems and equipment checks will be different depending on what the equipment is in your own workplace. So that's why this whole concept of context is so important. So the next part in our components to look at is our performance evidence. So this part and the knowledge evidence and the assessment conditions, those three sections all sit in the assessment requirements part of the unit of competency. So a few years back when they changed the layout and format of the units of competency, they kind of split it into two. So they had the unit overview and then they had the assessment requirements. And the assessment requirements now make it a bit clearer as to exactly what you must be able to confirm you've incorporated into your assessment practice. So you must have evidence of the ability to, and then it will give you these descriptors. So you must have evidence that someone can follow procedures and instructions and related to WHS and emergency incidents. You must have evidence that they can identify and report hazards to designated personnel and that they can contribute to WHS consultative processes. Similarly, there's a section called knowledge evidence, and this is the theory that sits behind doing these things. So you really can't do some of these activities that it's asking you to do unless you know what the expectations are, the procedures, the processes that must be followed when you actually do it for real. So that's where the knowledge evidence comes in. So again, it will give you a nice clear list of exactly what is the theory that sits behind the doing part, and these bits must also be included in your assessment components. And then we have, as I mentioned before, these assessment conditions, and they will often stipulate certain requirements about the assessment process. And it can be things like, can it be assessed in a simulated environment or must it be assessed in a real world? Do you have to complete a certain number of hours of demonstrating the skill in the real world, which might mean either that the person has to be employed or they would have a work experience vocational placement situation in place. It might give you details around the expectations of trainer assessor experience. It may give you specific pieces of equipment that are really clearly labelled, which you'll find in units like first aid and CPR. So always read these components of your unit of competency prior to getting started with actually putting your unit of competency assessment tools together. So then we come to this concept of really determining clearly who's your learner cohort, who's going to collect the evidence, so who's the assessor, or is it going to be jointly with a workplace supervisor or something similar? And then where is the assessment to be conducted? So again, very important to define all these things, and we'll have a look at the assessment plan that we define those things in shortly. And then we determine what our assessment method is. So we would then come up with, are we going to have a theory test? Are we going to observe someone completing a task in the workplace? Any of those sort of different assessment methods are available, and there really is no rules to say what it must be. I guess the kind of anecdotal rule is that you must always ensure that you have more than one method of assessment to be determining what's going on with your student when they're demonstrating competency, so that you can cover off on sufficiency and that you're able to demonstrate that competency in a variety of ways. So typically you'll be looking to determine that they know the content, which is more your knowledge-based assessment methods, questioning, role plays sometimes, looking at doing projects and things like that. And then you may need to assess that they can do the actual activity. So that would be different assessment methods like watching them do a task, so direct observation, or preparing a product, or putting together a portfolio, or sometimes third-party evidence, which is related to someone else watching them complete activities in the workplace. So really you can select what you believe is the best assessment method to suit what's going on in the unit of competency. So that's the end of our planning stage. So let's have a look at what that looks like for real. So if we go back to our unit of competency, within the unit of competency there is a ability to download the content you see on the screen into a Word document or a PDF. So normally I would suggest downloading the Word version and then opening it up, and then you can either print it off and get your little highlighters, or you can do it electronically on the screen. So once you've got your unit of competency, and this is exactly what you just saw on the screen, if we have a look at our elements and performance criteria, the first step is to really unpack it to understand within the unit of competency what is a skill and what is a knowledge within each of our performance criteria. So the clue here is that verbs are typically going to be your skills because they're the doing bits. And the other part that sits behind it is the knowledge that you would have to then be able to do the actual task or skill. So if we have a look at the first one, for example, so it's telling us that you must be able to work safely. You must be able to follow provided safety procedures and instructions when working. So if we think about what the knowledge is within that statement, you can't follow something if you don't know what it is. So I'm going to highlight safety procedures and instructions as the knowledge, and then the actual doing of it would be the following of it. So if you think about this in the real world, you would have some sort of written safety procedure and instructions. It might be on an intranet, it could be in a folder somewhere in the office related to safety. So whatever the workplace dictates is their safety procedures and instructions. Someone has to be taught the knowledge of what that is and how to follow it, and then you would have to assess someone actually doing it. So it's not enough to know that people know what to do. As an assessor, you must be able to hand on heart say they can actually follow them. So that's why we're talking about the fact that there are skills and knowledge embedded within most of these performance criteria. So the next one, for example, says carry out pre-start systems and equipment checks. So again, you would need to know what those pre-start systems and equipment checks are before you can actually carry them out. So you can see how this kind of forms a picture within your unit of competency. So you should never just assume that your new little learner knows what this knowledge is and they can just go ahead and do it without knowing what the theory is behind it. So I just suggest that whenever you first start writing a unit of competency, you sit down and you do this exercise where you unpack it and you have a look at what's a skill, what's a knowledge. And you can follow on and pick a unit of competency that you're going to do for your assessment and do a similar kind of process here. So then the next thing we do is we go through and put together what's called an assessment plan. And this is all part of our planning process where we do exactly what was mentioned in that ASQA guide. So we fill in a template. Now, templates within this industry, the vet sector, will always differ from organisation to organisation. So you would typically work with the organisation that you are going to be part of ongoing perhaps, and you're most welcome to use their templates when completing assessment work with your TAE if that's going to be something that's going to be helpful for you moving forward. Otherwise, there are templates provided within your assessment kit. So there's an example shown on the screen now. So this is really just capturing in a single page all those planning things that we just looked at in the ASQA guide. So the first thing we do is we cut and paste from training.gov what the unit is, and we look at what the assessment level is that we need to be aiming at when we are writing our assessment itself. Now, if we go back to training.gov and have a look at this unit, and if we have a look at all the different qualifications that it is listed as an elective for, or a core even, you can see it ranges from Cert 1 all the way up to Cert 4 by the looks. I don't think I see any diplomas in there. So it really, the AQF level that you assign will vary subject to the qualification that you are using this unit in. So if you're pulling this unit into a Cert 1 level qualification, you would write your assessment requirements around the expectations of an AQF level 1 candidate. So remember, we looked at the AQF 10 levels of education previously, and it gave us descriptors of what does a level 1 look like, what does a level 2 look like. So always go back and refresh yourself around that, because that will give you a bit of a clue as to how easy or hard you might be writing your assessment requirements based on that. And then the final question here is about whether or not the unit is being assessed holistically. So that was where we cluster. We talked about that before, so we're going to say no. But, you know, if you had a safety activity that related to contributing to health and safety of others, you could perhaps cluster it together if similar workplace tasks were happening. Then you would fill in who are the assessors going to be, and then you would also look at the assessment methods. So within this one, we're going to go with a very simple observation in the workplace and an open book exam and test. But again, there is no strict rules around it, provided you have sufficient evidence and that it's going to be fit for purpose of how you would be collecting evidence within the working of completing the tasks related to the activity here. So we would come up with our assessment instruments. So these are the physical things that you slap on the desk after you've completed your assessment method to show, here's the evidence that I have to hand on heart say that person could be deemed as competent. Then you need to provide details about the location, due date, time allowed, anything logistical to do with it, along with any resources and equipment. So quite often resources and equipment will be specified within the unit of competency. So it will tell you if you're doing CPR that you've got to have not just an adult mannequin, but you've got to have an infant mannequin and you've got to have a defib. So if your unit of competency specifies very strictly about certain equipment, then you would need to list all of those there. We are specifying our target learners. So for this example, they're Certificate 2 dance students commencing a first training program prior to entering the industry. And for this case, we're going to mention that some of the students are diagnosed with dyslexia, because as part of the assessment practice for this unit, you do need to have one unit of competency assessment tool where you are addressing a special need. So we're going to define that within this one. Then we've got our assessment conditions. So all we've done to populate this box is we've gone to the very bottom of our unit of competency and we've just cut and pasted in that whole section there. And then we have to think about any specific industry and workplace standards. So you may remember from the theory session on our assessment practice that it's not enough just to assess to the unit of competency. You also have to consider, is the industry telling you that there is a set standard or an expectation around behaviours of completing certain tasks that is industry specific, or workplace standards? So it could be as simple as your WHS legislation. So that kind of goes across most industries, so you could always have that in here. So that's the WHS Act of 2011. But because we've contextualised this to a dance world, we've also put in some specific industry standards that relate to the dance industry. Again, whatever industry you're in, you may have certain code of conducts or different standards or documents or regulations that relate to your industry, and you would pop those in there, and as a subject matter expert, you should have knowledge of what that might look like when you're watching people do certain skills or tasks. Then we list who our stakeholders are related to the assessment process. Again, no real right or wrong here. You would just have to pre-think who you would need to be liaising with. So if you're writing this in conjunction with a subject matter expert from industry, you would put their details in there. If you are the subject matter expert and you're writing it, then you may also need to schedule assessment arrangements with people like students and parents and the compliance person. It could be a school vet coordinator. So really there's no real right or wrong here. It's just pre-thinking who you would have to liaise with when it comes time to do the assessment. Then if there are any special needs identified, you would need to document what the arrangements are going to be. We call them reasonable adjustments that would need to happen to ensure that you are helping meet those special needs whilst not diminishing the assessment requirements of the actual unit of competency. So for this example, with our dyslexia, we're mentioning that we might adapt our learning resources, so have audio resources, or we may have hard copy ones printed on special paper that's easier to read. For those with reading challenges, we might allow more time, or we might arrange for a support to be in place, someone who could scribe, or maybe a tutor as a support person. And then finally, we've listed our recording and reporting procedures. So there's a few examples in there. Again, no real right or wrong, and it will depend on the RTO or the learning organisation. So we've just put in here that typically we'd mark the assessments, we'd provide feedback or results information to the students and ensure that they were quite aware of the process, and particularly if there's any resubmissions to happen, and we would coordinate those if required. Then we would complete what we call our record of outcomes, which is like your final sign-off for a unit of competency once you've collected all the evidence. We would then pass this on to the RTO, who would update this in the student management system, in the student record, and as part of that they would then submit data to the government. So that's kind of a brief summary of the recording and reporting procedures. So up here where we've listed what our assessment instruments are, you can now go ahead and start writing those, because for the knowledge test, for example, you've identified in your unit of competency with your highlighter what are the knowledge requirements that need to be catered for. So let's have a look at an example for this unit. This again is a template. Every RTO will have a different template for knowledge questions. As long as there is really good quality instructions in there, then it's not so much about the template, it's just making sure that there is no particular way that the student is not 100% clear about what the expectations are of them. And there's also areas to make any educational adjustments, so if you do need to have a reasonable adjustment in place, then you may use that as well. So we go ahead and we write our knowledge questions, and often the question is asked, how many questions do you need? What are your questions about? So you always, I believe, map your knowledge coverage as you go. So remember when we pulled down our unit of competency and we highlighted what's knowledge, what's a skill. So we're looking to make sure that we have covered off on all these things that we are saying are knowledge requirements within the unit of competency. So instead of having to just manually tick it off in our little dump down version of the unit of competency requirements, we put together what's called a mapping matrix. And this is really just cutting and pasting all the elements straight from training.gov and all the performance criteria straight from training.gov, along with the knowledge evidence and the performance evidence. So we put it into a template, and then down the right-hand side, we have columns that cover off as many different assessment tools as you believe you need for this unit of competency. So you may have more than 2 assessment tools. This example is quite a simplistic one, so we just have those 2 assessment tools, the knowledge questions and the observation checklist. But we're referencing within this mapping matrix, where are we covering all of these requirements? So I'm going to split screen it and just show you some examples of this as we go. So if we go back to our knowledge assessment and we look at the actual questions that we have written. So the first question was to do with what steps are taken in the event of a fire. So we label it as question 1 here in our knowledge questioning, and then over here you can see that question 1 is covering off on the workplace procedures for responding to emergency incidents. So once we've written question 1, we would put a 1 over here. But question 1, where we're following steps taken in the event of a fire emergency, is also part of following provided safety procedures and instructions when working. So often the same question can be mapped against different performance criteria. So again, we see question 1 down here is against identifying and reporting emergency incidents. So that's part of your process of responding to the fire, and that's included within the response there. So essentially, and every person is different when they write their assessment, I normally start with the knowledge evidence section, and I write questions based on the specifics of what's in the knowledge evidence. And then I find that once I've done that, when I go back to actually check whether I've covered those knowledge components that we highlighted within the unit, where does it map to above in the performance criteria? Now, some people do it differently. They would do it performance criteria by performance criteria, and they would just write a question for the knowledge that was highlighted as being embedded in that performance criteria, and that's okay too. So really, at the end of the day, what you're looking to do, though, is make sure that you've covered every single piece of knowledge requirement within the unit, and that you have got sufficient coverage of it. So you would always make sure that you have at least one skill-based observation knowledge assessment component, and you would have at least one knowledge coverage. Sometimes you'll have more, and you don't want to have too much, you don't want to over-assess, but you want to have enough sufficiency so that if that question was perhaps not fully covering the knowledge requirement of 2.1, that you maybe had a second question. So, and potential improvement for this knowledge test might be that you could look to have extra questions so that you've got maybe 2 questions covering the knowledge requirements. But it is compliant by having 2 different forms of assessment to cover that unit performance criteria. So you go through and you write your knowledge questions. Now, we've identified that this unit is going to be pulled into an AQF level 2, so a certificate 2 qualification. Therefore, we've got lots of images in our knowledge test. We've got matching games, we've got numbering knowledge questions, we've got tables to fill in. So we're not giving our students big, long answer type questions to do. So we don't have any explaining 500 words or less and analyse this and things like that. But we do have certain ones where they are required to explain. So important that you look at the language that's in your performance criteria or your knowledge evidence areas. So if it does say explain, then you need to ensure they can explain. If it does say define the meaning of, then you need to make sure they can define the meaning of. So you just go ahead and you write the knowledge questions based on your knowledge evidence. Then you map those same questions back up here into your performance criteria requirements. And just note that where you've got performance evidence requirements, so these are the skills, you don't have to map into that. So this column here for knowledge questions is only going to cover what we established was the knowledge evidence within units of competency and the performance criteria, but not the performance evidence. So this is the doing and this is the theoretical knowledge. So you do those bits separately. So again, there's kind of no right or wrong reasons about how many questions you might do, but certainly you just need to make sure that you can map all of them across. So that's our knowledge assessment. And then similarly, when it comes to our observation, again, remember we've identified in our highlighter pen what are the skills that sit within a particular unit of competency, and then we go and get our observation checklist. I think the observation checklist is sometimes a bit trickier for people to picture what's going on when they read a unit of competency. So if we get our mapping matrix back and we put them side by side, you'll notice that this unit in particular is very generic. So it's saying things like work safely. So if you, and I do this in a classroom again, I get everybody who's participating in a workshop to write down one thing that they're thinking of when they look at the outcome of work safely. And you'll find that just about everybody's got something different. So some will talk about PPE and some will talk about following certain procedures when using equipment and things like that. So really you have to make sure that you define what is the activity that's going on in the workplace that means that someone is working safely and that they're implementing these work safety requirements and that they're then able to participate in consultative processes, because it will look different in different workplaces. So in our observation checklist, we workshopped it, and we decided that the first work activity around safety would be our pre-start safety induction meeting. So that's when you first come to work at an organisation and you are being part of an actual meeting that's going to provide you with, I guess, instructions and all the details about what's going to go on today within the organisation around particularly that safety topic. So that's our first work activity. Then the second one we decided to do was a risk assessment of the actual working environment. So we were going to actually double check that there was nothing that was going to put anybody at risk within the working environments, within the dance studio work environment. And then because our unit of competency is making sure that we would know how to deal with an emergency, and I think it particularly mentions fire somewhere down here, then we were going to do a fire drill. And you can picture these things happening. So if you work in any workplace, you would normally have some sort of induction safety meeting, you would normally do some sort of risk assessment, and you would normally have some sort of drill so that you could cope with an emergency should it happen. So we then put together some outcomes around work activities, and then we look for the actual behaviour that's going to happen in support of that. So the tricky part here is that you must write it as though you were seeing it. So you can't just put down statements. You can't say things like performed work activity to industry standard. Because again, if you've got 10 assessors using that assessment tool, they may all be picturing something different when they read that. So you have to write this in really crystal clear behaviour of exactly what's going on that you can see. So if we look at the first one, for example, it says prepare to commence shift. So this is where someone turns up, they arrive on time, and they would normally have some sort of sign-in, which is part of your safety requirement. Then we're looking at what they're wearing. So there's safety requirements around uniforms and hair back and no jewellery and no long nails. And then we've got, there's a code of conduct that has to be pre-read and signed off. So these are all things that you can actually picture someone doing in the workplace. Then we're asking them to participate in the pre-start safety induction meeting. And when we say the word participate, what are the behaviours that sit behind that? So we want to see that they're engaged with the content of the meeting, so they're nodding and confirming, they have eye contact, they're contributing to the discussion, they're asking questions. So again, there's kind of no real right or wrong around what these behaviours are. You would just, as a subject matter expert, when you're writing an observation, you would be thinking about what is best practice in the industry for those particular tasks as they're happening. Then we're going to get them to acknowledge the safety roles. And then we're going to get them to participate in the risk assessment. And again, we've got the behaviours here. So they're going to walk around the studio and visibly identify any hazards. They're going to remove the hazards, and they're going to report upon those. So really, it's not that hard if you are able to actually picture something happening, and you can write your observation based on these specific behaviours. And then when it comes to mapping, you can see there's a reference number against each of these behaviours. So these observation items each get given a reference number. So then when you come back over to your mapping document, you can then have this column here called observation checklist, and you would put in where are these things being, what are they covering? So again, we're looking for the skill part of our unit of competency. So we're talking about the doing parts. So have they followed provided safety procedures and instructions? So by doing all of these activities they have, because they've done their safety induction, they've done their risk assessment, and they've done their fire drill. Have they carried out pre-start systems and equipment checks? So in 4, 5 and 6, they're doing their risk assessment, they're looking at their dance studio equipment, and they're completing their risk and hazard report. So 4, 5 and 6 is showing us that someone can carry out that pre-start systems and equipment check according to the dance studio workplace procedures. Have they followed procedures for responding to emergency incidents? So we've got our fire drill and our injury. So there are 2 different incidents. Note that there is a plural on the word incident. So 7, 8 and 9 is the behaviours that we are watching them do to know that they can participate in an emergency fire drill and deal with an injured person. So on and so forth. Again, when you're doing an observation, you don't map it to the knowledge evidence, but you do have performance evidence that's down the bottom. So again, I guess in summary, when we're looking at writing our observation, very important to really picture what are the work activities that are going on that will cover all the little items that you've highlighted, the performance doing outcomes that have to be demonstrated. Once you've determined what those work activities are, break it down into little observation items and then make sure that you are writing them with a verb. So they're always doing ones: participate, acknowledge, complete, raise. All these verbs are your commencement language, and then break it down into actual behaviours that you can picture people doing in the real world. So it can be quite time consuming to put this together because you can often have to think about the little minor details that relate to each of these performance criteria. So you as a subject expert, you're kind of on autopilot when you do some of these things, and often it's tricky to actually break it down. It's like if you had to teach a Martian how to clean their teeth, you would have to, start by the knowledge of what is toothpaste and toothbrush and those sorts of things, and then you would have to step them through removing the cap, finding the toothbrush, turning on the tap. So if you think about breaking it down so that you're teaching someone who's never had anything to do with these skills and knowledge, and breaking it down into simple language so that it's very, very clear what the expectation is. And that's really it when it comes to putting together your assessment tools. So the final step in the process then is doing your review. So if we go back to our guide, they give some good examples here. So really worth, I would suggest getting a copy of this, downloading a copy of this guide from Esquire, and then making sure that you can really go through it. So we've covered all of that. And then if we look at our final step, which is our quality checks, then it says you should undertake several checks before implementing a new assessment tool. Sometimes you would do a review with subject matter experts, so within industry, to make sure that it's really fit for purpose and relevant to the workplace that it's been designed for. So they as subject matter experts or industry should be able to read your assessment tool and know exactly what's going on. So what are the tasks you're getting someone to do, and do they happen for real in the real world? Then you should maybe have a bit of a review or a validation, we call it, with other trainer assessors, because sometimes it takes a fresh set of eyes to read what you've suggested is the best way to assess something, and someone else might look at it and be able to pick up something that's missing, or they might do a cross-check of your mapping and say, look, I don't really think that question covers that, or maybe that task is not clear enough, or something in the instructions may need tweaking. And then often, if you have the time, a trial is conducted. So you may use the tool with a set cohort of learners, and you would then get feedback from the learners and the trainer assessors who are administering it, and then you would do an actual validation formally after you've trialled the tool, so that you could then improve upon it. And certainly getting feedback from your learners is quite critical there, because they're the ones who are reading the questions, and if they don't understand what you're asking for in a question, then the question maybe needs to be rewritten. So this quality check step is conducted using a validation form, and certainly that would form part of your procedures around quality checks within the RTO. So a validation can be done before you release, and then also after you've released. So that concludes our step-by-step guide to writing an assessment tool. I hope it's been helpful, and good luck with applying the same processes to your own units of competency that you choose. Bye for now.